So I have to do the introduction stuff anyway. I'm Michael Shermer, the director of the Skeptic Society and the publisher of Skeptic Magazine. We are hosting a special on Carl Sagan with the publication of his 2 biographies by William Poundstone and Key Davidson. And we're going to spend the hour discussing Carl, his life, and what it means. And so I got to thinking about this whole subject of what is the measure of a life when it is gone. An obit in the newspaper, a short story in a magazine, a tribute from family, friends, and colleagues, a potted television biography, 500-page book. How should we capture the essence of that life? A list of accomplishments, highlights and lowlights, interviews with family, friends, and colleagues, and a few critics thrown in for good measure. A womb-to-tomb narrative. And if that life was extraordinary, a life of greatness, an epochal creating life, how is a contemporary biographer to put that life in perspective when the epic is still going on? What tools should we use? Oral history interviews, demographic and statistical compilation, document analysis? What fields should we consult? Psychology, sociology, cultural history? Does the measure of a life depend as much on who is doing the measuring as it does on the measured life itself? Or can we actually get to the meaningful core of a person? Can there be a science of biography? Well, I was reading Barbara Tuchman's book, A Distant Mirror, and she had an interesting statement at the beginning of this book about the convolution of history. In fact, how contradictions are a part of life, not merely a matter of conflicting evidence. She says, I would ask the reader to expect contradictions, not uniformity. No aspect of society, no habit, custom, movement, development is without cross-currents. Starving peasants in hovels lived alongside prosperous peasants in feather beds. Children are neglected and children are loved. Knights talk of honor and turn brigand. Amid depopulation and disaster, extravagance and splendor were never more extreme. No age is tidy or made of whole cloth, and none is more checkered fabric than the Middle Ages. And that's beautiful Barbara Tuchman writing. But we can apply this to a single life as well. No life is tidy or made of whole cloth, and none is more checkered fabric than Carl Sagan's. One problem with narrative biography is determining whether a description of one's subject by a colleague, a friend, family member represents a long-term personality trait or a short-term temporal state. Was Carl Sagan a tender-minded liberal, or was he a tough-minded careerist? Was he a feminist or misogynist? Was he really obsessed with the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence, or was this just a passing fancy that happened to generate a lot of media attention? How can we tell? The problem is if you start off with the hypothesis, it's easy to mine the data to find quotes and examples that fit what you're looking for to slant a particular history to go in one way or the other. Now, the dream of a historian or social scientist is to have it all in one place to look at. And fortunately for us, Carl Sagan was almost obsessive with keeping track of everything he did. Most curriculum vitas are 12, 15, 20 pages, 50 pages. This is Carl Sagan's curriculum vita. It's 265 pages, single-space typed. So I mined the data, not to test any one hypothesis, but just to kind of look at a life from some statistical points of view. So you could start off with something simple like this. These are Sagan advisory groups, professorship, lectureships, professional societies by type. Total 293, 137 advisory groups. This is anything from, a board of advisors for like Skeptic or The Humanist or whatever, to professional groups, lectureships, professional societies, editorial positions, patent designs, 26 short biographies, and now 2 full-length biographies, and they're both here today. We can look at Carl Sagan fellowships, awards, and prizes by type. Won quite a few, total of 89. But what did he get them for? That matters, because what was it that was important to him that people rewarded him for? Number 1, humanitarianism, humanism, and peace. This is all the environmental stuff that he worked on, nuclear winter, and so on. Popularization of science and education, which he's probably most famous for. His scientific research, outstanding overall achievement, 13 of them. Only 2 for scientific writing. However, numbers don't just just say it all. One of those two is the Pulitzer Prize. So that's not so bad, I think. We can look at honorary degrees by type. He got honorary degrees, a number of them. In fact, 23 total, 14 doctorate of science, and so on and so forth, 23 total. I should note that, that these statistics only really matter in context. I mean, one of the questions I was interested in is, why was Carl not nominated to the National Academy of Science? How would he compare to other members of the National Academy of Science? Well, I called the National Academy of Science, I called the AAAS, and they just don't have that kind of data. Other people do, and I just didn't have time to put all that together. But so what I did was I called 3 prominent, eminent scientists, all members of the National Academy of Science. You all know who they are: Jared Diamond, Ed Wilson, and Ernst Mayr. So by comparison, Sagan has 23 honorary doctorates. Ed Wilson has, let's see, Ed Wilson has 26 honorary degrees, which he was happy to tell me. One of the characteristics of a great man, is of a driven careerist, as it were, is you keep track of your statistics. I mean, Pete Rose and some of these fanatical baseball players, they're famous for this, and a 265-page curriculum vitae is a great example of this. Wilson knew right off the top of his head, yeah, 23 for him. I had 26. When I talked to Ernst Mayr's 95 years old, and so he's had a few 35 years more than Carl, 34 years more than Carl, accumulate these things. Nevertheless, he said, I only have 16, but mine are the cream of the crop. My doctorates are from Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and Yale and Bologna. He said, and you know Bologna is the world's oldest university. Okay, Ernst, I got it. I mean, these guys, you know, they didn't get to where they are by being lack of self-confidence. We can look at books. I did a content rating of Carl Sagan's books. I mean, what's he interested in? What's he writing about? Planetary science, the most, 10. He was a planetary scientist, first and foremost. That was his most conservative thing that he did. But exobiology and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, 8 books. General science, 6. Nuclear war and environment, 5. 2 on evolution. I should say that 12 of these were solo authored. The other 19 are co-authored. So Sagan was very good at working with other people and sharing ideas and data. Oh, I should put by comparison here. Ed Wilson has 23 books, 9 solo author, 8 co-authored, 6 co-edited. Ernst has 21 books, 13 solo authored, and 4 co-authored. But Ernst was quick to tell me that one of them was 900 pages long. Okay. And I'm telling you, at 95, he did not have to go to his notes to explain this to me. Sagan scientific articles by content, 500 publications, 67 publications in Science or Nature. Science and Nature are the 2 most prestigious journals. When you go to the www.science.com and look at their criteria for what you should consider before you submit your paper, they ask you, is this the most important thing you've ever done? Is this the most original work you've ever done? And if you told nobody about the results, then you can consider sending it in. All right? 67 of those is not bad. I should note that this includes abstracts, which is a little unfair. My other guys, Jared Diamond and Ernst Mayr and Ed Wilson, did not include abstracts in their CV, and they felt that was a little bit of a cheat. So when we actually do the comparison, and by the way, before I put that up, planetary science, again, #1 priority in his scientific publication, almost double the second one of exobiology at 158. I broke out exobiology from SETI as 2 different things. Most of the exobiology papers are having to do with the origins of, chemical origins of life, things like that, not actual intelligences. And then 16 papers on nuclear winter and nuclear war. So clearly, again, he's a highly regarded, conservative planetary scientist. He's not out there on the fringe like that at all. Now, when you compare it to the other guys, Carl in context, career scientific publications. I took out the abstracts, so that puts him at 412, compared to Ed Wilson at 380, Jared Diamond at 549, and Ernst at 704. And Ernst knew immediately, as of today, 704. the rate of publication, oh, I think I forgot to print out my, no, I have it here. The rate of publication is slightly different. Jared's, no, I didn't print that out. Jared's is actually the highest if you do publications per year, because Ernst's 95 and Jared's is 55. So Jared's comes out at 13.4 a year. Carl's is 10.3. Ed's was 7.2. So Carl's certainly in the ballpark of the most eminent scientists today. Not the highest, but it also shows you what a highly regarded scientist Jared Diamond is as well. If you look at this was quite an interesting thing. This took me almost all day Saturday to do this. This was Carl Sagan popular articles by content. Forget that. That's 1380. It's a typo. 271 was the highest one. The most written about thing by Carl in non-scientific publications, these are just magazine articles and so on, is SETI and space exploration. That was his true passion. Not just his scientific passion, but his personal passion there. And there it is. The data speak for themselves. Actually, the number 2 most common thing written about was Sagan himself. 263 interviews or profiles of Carl and or his wife, Anne. And then nuclear war and winter is pretty close to that, as well as social commentary. I broke these out. Environment and nuclear war is one. Social commentary is like women's rights, abortion rights, free speech, things like that. And then all the way down. See, exobiology is quite small compared to these over here. So again, that gives us a feeling for where his interests lie, where he vested a lot of his time. Carl Sagan, scientific popular articles by year. Question is did he lose scientific credibility and productivity after Cosmos and becoming such a productive popularizer of science? The answer is no. And you can see it in the data. Here's the big spike. Cosmos airs, whoop, number of popular articles. But the pace of his scientific production continues throughout. I mean, there's little fluctuations throughout, as there are in all careers, and there's a little dip just before 1980 because, of course, when you're producing a 13-part series for PBS, there's no time to actually do the research, so there's not many papers coming out just after that. But he gets back on track. So he was accused of being a mere popularizer and not doing real science. Not true. There it is. And these are peer-reviewed. And again, Science and Nature are in there prominently. Finally, I wanted to look at Carl Sagan personality. Again, if you say, he was a tough-minded careerist, or was he a tender-minded liberal supporting women's rights, what was he? Well, one way to answer that question, and I'm going to kind of go through this quickly, but this will all be in my next essay in Skeptic, in which I sort of look at all this in a little more detail. Frank Sulloway and I, Frank is here, a social scientist, wherever Frank went. Where'd you go, Frank? Oh, there he is back there, Frank Sulloway. Thank you for coming, Frank, from UC Berkeley. Frank and I did a mailing to a bunch of Carl's family members, friends, colleagues, and asked them to fill out this. This is what's called the Big Five personality scale. What we're measuring is conscientiousness, agreeableness, openness to experience, extroversion, and neuroticism. And they were to answer the question, I see Carl Sagan as someone who was, and then on a scale of 1 to 9, not dutiful, dutiful, trusting, suspicious, interested in the arts, organized, disorganized, and so on. These 40 adjective pairs then reduced down to these 5 different personality dimensions, and then from that you correlate them, and then you correlate the raters to see the consistency between the raters. I mean, if they're scattered all over the board, he was liberal, he was conservative, then what can we say? But the correlation that Frank ran for me on these was a 0.74 correlation between the raters, which is, in social sciences, that's plenty high, that's respectable, that's enough, that we can say something intelligent about Carl Sagan's personality in context of the population at large, which Frank Sulloway has a database of over 7,000 people in his computer. So we just rank Carl by his raters compared to his personality. For example, on conscientiousness, he's at the 88th percentile of the general population. Very high in conscientiousness. Very low in agreeableness, okay? So he's tough-minded. He'd rather be right than nice, I guess would be one way to say it. He's willing to stand up and for what he believes to be true. He can be hard-headed, that kind of thing. The other significant one was quite interesting, 97th percentile in openness to experience. Wow. I mean, to be a pioneer in a science, in a field, you really need to be open to experiences. These two are not particularly significant, although in neuroticism there is the compulsiveness component, and I think that's probably pretty high as evidence of this as data. I should note, too, in that 1,380 popular science articles are included articles not about Carl, but about a subject in which he was interviewed. And when I told that to Jared and Ed and Ernst, they just groaned. They would never include something like that because it's not something he wrote and it's not an interview with him. So I think that spiked a little bit high, but of course that's a product of being famous. You get called a lot. But the actual keeping track of it is a clue for us about his personality. This is somebody who is really a hard-nosed careerist, and he's keeping track of all the data, everybody that called him and so on, and had somebody to help him with that. So now, in the context of his particular revolution, his search for extraterrestrial intelligence, I did this search, Carl Sagan, in context with the SETI pioneers. There's a book called The SETI Pioneers, in which some of this data was collected, the birth order data was collected. I then got the rest of it through the book and some other sources. Let me break that down for you so you can actually read it. Carl in context, the SETI pioneers. You'll see an interesting development here. This is birth rank and total SIB-ship size. First of two, first of two, first of two, two of two, but older sister, so firstborn son. First of three, second of two, but again, firstborn son. First of two, second of two, again, firstborn son. First of two, only child. Sagan, first of two. Two of seven, one of seven, one of two, only one of three. Now, the author of this book makes the observation, isn't that interesting? There seems to be a preponderance of firstborns in the SETI movement. But he never asks the obvious next question. Is it significantly greater than what you would expect in any other population? So by itself, it's completely meaningless. But thanks again to Frank Sulloway, there's an actual test you can run, a statistical test, and you figure out what this population size is, you know what the general population size is, the average rate of firstborns and so on, and you do the calculations, and it turns out this is statistically significant at the 0.05 level. It's not as good as 0.01, but still it's statistically significant that this is more firstborns than you would expect by random chance at a statistically significant level. Now, so what? What's going on with firstborns? Well, as Frank shows in Born to Rebel, those kinds of personality characteristics, conscientiousness in particular, and that tough-mindedness as measured in this sort of low agreeableness, are typical of firstborns. But what about this openness to experience? Well, firstborns are just, the birth order is just a proxy for other things going on. For example, if you have high conflict with your parents, then you're more open to, then you're more like a later born than a firstborn. Carl didn't have high conflict with his parents, got along great with his parents. His mother loved him, adored him, and that's a big part of the biographies. It's fascinating. So what else is going on? Well, he's raised Jewish, and members of oppressed groups tend to be more liberal, more supportive of liberal causes, and so on. And in fact, as we saw on the statistics on the things he published, and popular articles in particular that he wrote, he was very socially liberal, extremely socially liberal. And so that would explain the openness to experience. And then the final thing, I'm not sure, and I'm still playing around with this in my mind, this whole SETI thing. What is SETI? I mean, all of these guys believe that there probably are extraterrestrial intelligences, or else they wouldn't be in that field, right? They wouldn't have been pioneers in the field. They wouldn't be working in it. But they were all asked in that book on the SETI pioneers, do you believe in UFOs? Not one of them. I mean, there was a tiny bit of equivocation. Oh, maybe, you know, who knows, but probably not. And so they believe in the sort of a high class, highbrow form of extraterrestrial, not the lowbrow abduction stuff with crop circles and stuff like that. So finally, I was looking at their religious backgrounds. All of these guys were raised in some sort of religious family: Church of England, Anglican Orthodox, several Jews. Of course, Sagan was Jewish, and they're all atheists, all of them. Well, all of them were non-believers. It was difficult to code because they didn't ask directly. You had to infer it from the interviews in this book. But they were all at least non-believers, or I couldn't tell from, or they just came out and said, I'm an atheist. And Carl was certainly pretty strong about that. So I'm speculating, and I can't prove this, but it's just sort of an interesting idea, and our biographers can comment on that if they wish, that SETI is almost a quasi-religion, kind of spiritual movement in a way. There's absolutely not a shred of evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. I suspect, like most people, that they're probably out there. But yet driving that is this idea that there's something transcendent to us, a higher intelligence of some kind. And that they've somehow survived destruction of their environment and the ecosystem in themselves, and so they must be wiser than us, more intelligent than us. They're almost deified. I mean, that's what you see in these science fiction novels and films, and it's a little bit of that in Contact, to be sure. Anyway, so that's just having a little fun with a weekend in Carl Sagan's CV. Of course, that isn't a life. Humans are storytelling animals, and the story is really where the action is, the narrative in which you take that data and weave it into a story, and that's what our two guests have done today. So we have two wonderful speakers today, William Poundstone and Key Davidson. So we're going to start off with William Poundstone and his biography from Wiley, Carl Sagan, A Life in the Cosmos. What? Oh, yeah, right, sorry. But anyway, come on up. You want to stay at the podium.
Okay. Well, thank you. One of my first editors told me something that I've always remembered. He said that there's a maxim in the world of publishing that you've got 10 seconds to sell a book. You'd better be able to explain whatever is new and exciting about your book faster than someone can pick up a remote. Well, I've remembered that because it's really scary to anyone who tries to write a serious book. I've written what I'd like to think is a nuanced account of the life of Carl Sagan. And the thing that everyone seems to focus on, and you may be ahead of me, is that Carl Sagan smoked marijuana. Well, now don't get me wrong, I thought this was a perfectly good revelation as biographical tidbits go. But it certainly has gotten a lot of publicity, and it seems to interest people. In general, it seems that there's a feeling that marijuana just doesn't sit with the image that people have of Carl Sagan. Sagan was almost our culture's living Mr. Spock, the embodiment of science and rationality. That there was this other side to Sagan seems to have upset a lot of people. Well, I'm often asked to account for this seeming paradox, if such it is. Well, today I'd like to do so in a little more detail than the usual soundbite. And since this is the Skeptic Society, I'd like to look at how Sagan and marijuana may or may not tie into skepticism. Yes. Well, when I first started writing this book, I had no idea that marijuana was going to be part of it. I knew only that Sagan was a very private man. No full-length biography had been published in his lifetime. Now, that's kind of amazing when you consider just how famous he was, and that we live in a society where Ricky Martin rates half a dozen biographies. Well, now Sagan rates 2, so I guess we're making progress there. One of the very first people I interviewed for the book was Dr. Lester Grinspoon. Now, Grinspoon is a Harvard Medical School psychiatrist who was Carl's best friend for most of his life. In fact, Carl credited Lester with saving his life once during a hospital stay. So in a very real sense, if it wasn't for Grinspoon, we probably wouldn't even be here today talking about Carl Sagan. I might also add that Grinspoon was involved in many of Sagan's skeptical interests. It was actually Grinspoon who got permission for Sagan to listen to the hypnosis tapes of Barney and Betty Hill, the first celebrated case of alien abduction. And 30 years later, it was Grinspoon and Sagan who tried to convince their Harvard colleague John Mack that alien abductions were fantasy and not reality. As you may have noticed, they failed to convince Mack of that. But these are sidelights on Grinspoon's career. He's by far best known as a leading advocate for the decriminalization of marijuana. Now, you're probably thinking, aha, it was this Grinspoon who turned Sagan onto marijuana. Well, actually, I found out it was almost the opposite. I first met Dr. Grinspoon in his Cambridge office. I'm not quite sure what I expected him to be like. I guess the only mental image I had was Timothy Leary, another Harvard man. Well, Grinspoon is really nothing like that. He's now in his 60s, and he certainly dresses as conservatively as you'd expect a Harvard doctor to dress. But he also has this very accessible, regular guy look and manner to him that maybe isn't so typically Harvard. Well, anyway, he told me that he first met Carl at a cocktail party in the mid-1960s. Now, the conversation had turned to the war in Vietnam. And despite what you probably think about Harvard in the 60s, practically everyone there was all for the war. The two who weren't were Carl and Lester, so they ended up introducing themselves. Well, at that time, Carl Sagan was a brash young astronomer on his way up in the world. He was already advising NASA on its missions to Mars and Venus. But really his personal and professional focus was the so-called science of exobiology. This is defined as the study of life beyond the Earth. Now, the problem with exobiology then and now is that they didn't really have anything to study. But, but Sagan was pretty convinced that there was a good chance of life on Mars, and he was dead set on being part of the scientific team that would discover the first Martians, assuming that the Martians cooperated by being there. Well, Lester Grinspoon was about to embark on his own quite different professional crusade. At that time, the use of marijuana was increasing among young people, and as a psychiatrist, he was alarmed by that trend. Grinspoon had the idea of compiling a truly scientific case against marijuana and publishing it so that people would realize what the dangers were. But as this work progressed, Grinspoon's ideas about the drug made almost a 180-degree turn. Now, this was for many reasons. He found, first of all, that there had been few scientific studies of the drug. The few most credible ones failed to demonstrate the sort of hazards that were widely being claimed. Grinspoon's work culminated in a 1971 book called Marijuana Reconsidered. I think this book is interesting for a skeptic to read, even if you're sure it's dead wrong and it's not going to convince you of anything. Well, anyway, Grinspoon found that Sagan served as almost a kind of walking object lesson for him. When they met, Sagan had been using marijuana for half a dozen years. Grinspoon had never tried the drug at all. And the thing that impressed Grinspoon was that Sagan seemed to defy all the stereotypes about pot smokers. Far from being laid back, Sagan was the most extreme sort of workaholic. He was certainly a man with a sense of a scientific mission to accomplish. And Sagan was apparently able to use the drug in sensible moderation without any obvious ill effects. Well, one chapter of Grinspoon's 1971 book concerns literary accounts of people's experiences with marijuana. Now, for the most part, Grinspoon excerpted these from the writings of people like Baudelaire and Allen Ginsberg. But Grinspoon got the idea it would be great if Carl would write his own account. Well, somehow he talked him into doing it. Carl agreed on the condition that it be published anonymously. So he used the name Mr. X. Well, I've written scientific biography before, and I can tell you it's the hardest thing in the world to get scientists to talk about their sex lives, or about anything aside from science, pretty much. Well, the Mr. X piece is amazingly candid, certainly about the drugs, and to a degree about other aspects of Sagan's life as well. So it was really quite a revelation. In this Mr. X piece, Sagan claims that cannabis enhanced the enjoyment of everything from sex to classical music to baked potatoes. He seems to think that he was able to function pretty normally while using the drug. He even says he sometimes drove a car while stoned. And I should add that that's something even normal tells people not to do in these more safety-conscious times. But the most unusual thing about Sagan's experiences, I think, was doing science while under the influence. Now, in the Mr. X piece, he writes, I quote, "I have made an effort to think of a few particularly difficult problems in my field when high. I find that it works, at least to a degree. I am able to bring to bear a range of experimental facts which appear to be mutually inconsistent." Unquote. Well, Grinspoon assured me that Sagan really believed he got many of his best ideas this way. He remembered one occasion where someone sent him, Grinspoon, an unsolicited gift of marijuana, and it turned out to be one of those particularly potent batches. Well, as soon as Carl found out about that, he said, "You've got to give that to me. I've got work to do." Now, the inspirations that Carl got or thought he got from the drug were not always limited to astronomy. On one occasion, Carl was in the shower while high and had a profound insight into the origins of racism. Well, Carl believed that this was such a great idea that it was vital that he remember it and disseminate it. But he knew from experience that if he didn't write it down immediately, he would forget it and it would be gone. So he grabbed a bar of soap and began writing frantically on the walls of the shower. Well, somehow he got out of the shower and continued writing on paper. At the end of about an hour, he found that he had written 11 short essays addressing many of the world's great social, political, and philosophical problems. He reread those essays the next day. He found that most of the ideas held up pretty well, and he reports that he ended up using many of those ideas in his lectures and books. Well, I should add that Sagan was not an uncritical dabbler in drugs. At about this time, LSD was certainly as trendy as marijuana, and it was also being touted as a source of so-called mind-expanding insights. But Sagan refused to try LSD. His reasoning, which he goes into in his Mr. X piece, was partly that the drug is dangerous because the dosage is just so minute that there's really no way of controlling it in a casual situation. In fact, he even applies what you might call typical Sagan logic to this. In the Mr. X piece, Sagan proposes a mathematical ratio to measure the risk potential of a recreational drug. Now, this he defines as the length of time it takes for a dose of the drug to take effect divided by the length of time it would take to consume a dangerous dose. Well, if you do the math, you find it's a huge high number for LSD. For marijuana, it's quite low. And Sagan writes that he hopes to see this ratio printed on the packs of soon-to-be legalized cannabis cigarettes. Well, of course, a lot has changed since Sagan wrote those words. More than ever, probably, marijuana is very much a hot button in our culture. Sagan made Grinspoon promise never to reveal Mr. X's identity. He surely wasn't ashamed of his drug use, but he was aware that disclosure could have professional repercussions. After all, he had to pass security clearances for NASA, and he was always testifying before Congress. Well, both men took this vow of secrecy quite seriously. Grinspoon mentioned that many years later, Sagan's firstborn son, Dorian, grew up, and he read Marijuana Reconsidered. Now, Dorian was able to put two and two together. He went to Grinspoon, who had been practically an uncle to him, and asked him if Carl wasn't Mr. X. But Grinspoon denied it. He felt he had to in view of his promise to Sagan. There was another occasion where Grinspoon wrote an article for the New York Times. He commented that marijuana was being used by people in all walks of life, kindergarten teachers, clergymen, et cetera, and he happened to throw in astronomers. Well, when Carl read that, he was shocked. I mean, he was upset even by that very, very oblique mention. So you're probably asking, how did Grinspoon come to tell me? Well, as it turned out, it was one of the things he mentioned in our very first conversation together. He explained that he hadn't told anyone about Mr. X, but believed that a posthumously published biography was the proper place for it. But he was extremely concerned about how this information would be presented. He asked me if I used marijuana and what my views on it were. Well, I went to high school at the very peak of the early 70s drug culture. Not that I was using drugs, I was in one of the nerdy cliques. We really didn't know much about drugs until, that is, we went to health class. Our health teacher was this 300-pound ex-Marine who showed us these great anti-drug films. The one I remember best was narrated by Sonny and Cher. Now, it had this segment that was purported to show exactly what it was like to be on an LSD trip. I can only imagine that the point was that this was supposed to be horrifying and scare kids out of ever using drugs. But all I can tell you is it was beautiful and imaginative, and I thought it looked great. Well, all my friends and I agreed that we had had zero interest in drugs before, but having seen these health class films, we definitely wanted to try them. Well, eventually I grew up, and I tried marijuana, at least, at parties. And it struck me as, well, maybe not as good as the health class films, but certainly very enjoyable. I should add, though, that I suppose I still qualify as a nerd in that marijuana has never been a really big part of my life. But certainly, as I told Grinspoon, I had no problem with Sagan's political stance about marijuana. It seemed very well reasoned, as did most of Sagan's political stances. But as I mentioned to Grinspoon, there is this tendency to boil any book, and certainly a biography, down to the 10-second revelation. And it's one thing for me to devote half a dozen pages in the book to exploring Sagan's elaborate intellectual rationale for using marijuana, but that doesn't prevent the media from excerpting this one factoid out of context and running the headline like "Top Astronomer, a Pothead." Well, the first direct feedback I got on my book was actually well before publication. I sent copies of the manuscript to some of Sagan's family and friends for review. Foremost among them certainly was Carl's widow, Anne Druyan. Now, Anne Druyan is a very open advocate of the decriminalization of marijuana. She actually sits on the board of NORML, the National Organization to Reform Marijuana Legislation. But I knew that she and Carl had had a falling out with the Grinspoons. In the last decade of his life, particularly, Carl could be an absolute terror to get along with. Now, I should add that not everyone felt this way, but certainly a statistically significant fraction of the people I interviewed did. And in many cases, Carl would terminate literally a decades-long friendship for reasons that to an outsider seemed pretty trivial. Well, the upshot was that he and Lester were scarcely talking in the last few years of Carl's life. So I wasn't quite sure how Julian would take to this Mr. X material. Well, fortunately, she was totally supportive of my discussion of the whole marijuana issue, including Mr. X. Her only concern was one of balance. She wanted me and my readers to understand that marijuana was something Sagan used in moderation. And she gave me an example of that actually struck me as kind of funny at the time. She mentioned that Carl was always going on these overseas trips, and he obviously couldn't take the drug in his luggage when he had to go through customs. So she said that he would often go for weeks without marijuana. Well, that struck me as funny because, because it reminded me of the great W.C. Fields line about traveling the Sahara without a corkscrew and having to subsist for weeks on nothing but food and water. Now, I know you're saying that's flippant, and it is, but the more I thought about that, the more I realized Druyan's point. We live in a society where a drunk can be funny and lovable, but even the most temperate user of cannabis is apt to be viewed a lot less tolerantly. I can give you one example from my own experience. I once wrote a book on the great mathematician John von Neumann. Now, he was notorious for downing a pint of rye whiskey at one sitting and then stepping behind the wheel of his Cadillac. Now, fortunately, he didn't kill himself or anyone else, but he had accidents all the time. There is, to this day, an intersection in Princeton that the locals point out as Von Neumann Corner, where he had all these accidents. And as far as I can tell, no one who read the Von Neumann book had the slightest problem with that. If anything, it was a great story that humanized the guy. Well, between Mr. Davidson's book and my own, I think it's fair to say that the Sagan marijuana story has had its 15 minutes of media fame. The media seem to have found this mystifying, but the stories really weren't too negative. I suppose the unkindest thing I saw was in People magazine, which ran a review starting with the claim, Carl Sagan was a pot-smoking, thrice-married, spoiled son. Even so, I have to admit that all three claims are pretty accurate. One reaction to the book that I didn't quite expect is that this whole marijuana story seems to have roughly split the skeptic movement, and as far as I can tell, split them about down the middle. About half the people I've spoken with have no problem with this whatsoever. The other half feels somehow betrayed. Among this latter group seems to be Sagan's good friend, James Randi. I read on an internet news group that Randi was saying that, well, first of all, he wasn't even sure whether to believe the marijuana stories, but in any case, he was very much against any mind-altering substances. Well, I think you can make a very strong and certainly self-consistent case supporting Randi's position. If you want to minimize all risk, I think it's obvious that it's best to use no recreational drugs at all. You may also feel that sober reality is good and any altered state of consciousness is less good. That's sort of a personal value judgment, and as such, one that I don't think you can really criticize. But on that latter point, Sagan clearly differed from Randi. He liked the way marijuana made him feel, even felt that it somehow helped him with his work, and believed that that was justification for using it. Well, I think we have to accept that this is a point on which two very famously reasonable minds differ. But I'd like to close by posing the question of why there has been such an almost emotional reaction to this revelation, if you want to call it that Carl Sagan smoked marijuana. Well, I think the answer lies in the fact that drugs are more than chemicals. They carry a great deal of cultural baggage as well. To most of us, marijuana has certain implications or certain associations. It's probably associated with hippies, reggae, liberal politics, and above all, defiance, for it is illegal. As Sagan in particular was very aware, the youth culture that embraced marijuana was often very suspicious of science. It often linked it to the Vietnam War and the atomic bomb. Well, I suspect that this may be behind the reaction that I detect from some skeptics, that marijuana is incompatible with skepticism. Incompatible in a way that martinis aren't, I guess. Furthermore, marijuana carries the connotation of hedonism, which, as we all know, is a very dangerous thought in American society. We are back to this Mr. Spock idea that logic and emotion just don't mix. Well, Sagan sometimes struggled with that mixture himself. His first marriage was to Lynn Margulis, who of course is now hailed as one of the greatest of all living biologists. His second wife was Linda Salzman, an artist and later a TV writer. To some of Carl's friends, it seemed that in these two marriages, he had veered from an overwhelming emphasis on brains to an equally overwhelming emphasis on body. Carl saw a therapist as this second marriage faltered. The therapist finally told him that his problem was he had to decide between his brain and his prick. But Carl's reaction to that was, why can't I have both? Well, that type of conflict is something you see throughout Sagan's life, and I think throughout a lot of scientists' lives. In our society, pleasure and emotion are held to be at odds with the logic and skepticism that are the scientists' stock in trade. Now, some scientists respond by becoming emotionally stunted. I suppose I would have to place John von Neumann in that category. But then there are other scientists, like Sagan, who make a very conscious effort to strike a balance. In his Mr. X piece, Sagan wrote that he first tried marijuana at a time in his life when he realized that there was, quote, more to life than science. To Sagan, marijuana seems to have been emblematic of that other, not-so-rational side of life. And I suppose to a lot of people, not just scientists, that can be kind of a threatening idea. Now, Sagan was certainly not perfect at reconciling the intellectual and emotional sides of life, but he was wise enough to realize that he could have both. And I think that's an important key to understanding Sagan as a person and to understanding why people are upset by Mr. X. Thank you.
Thank you, William Poundstone. The book is Carl Sagan, A Life in the Cosmos. The publisher is Henry Holt. I misspoke before. Sorry, clarify that. I'm going to go straight to Key Davidson to speak, and then we'll do questions, and then we'll do the video to make sure that we get it all in the hour. Key Davidson is the science writer for the San Francisco Examiner. His book is Carl Sagan, A Life. Key Davidson.
Bill, that was a superb speech, and I agree with a lot of the sentiments you expressed in there. I think that's a very good analysis of Carl and his relationship with marijuana and his relationship with people in general. I'm going to leap right into a somewhat different topic, depending on your point of view, and that is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Now, that's the subject with which Carl is probably most popularly associated in the popular imagination. I think that a lot of people have the idea that Carl had his own radio telescope in his backyard, and he was out there listening for radio signals from other civilizations. He did not, actually, but he was certainly a figure who did more than any single person of all time to popularize the idea that the universe out there may be filled with hundreds of billions of stellar systems, planetary systems, some of which might have intelligent beings inhabiting those planets, beings that might have the technology and the will to communicate with us across interstellar distances, much as we might say, to use someone else's analogy, communicate with the ancient Greeks by reading their writings, or they might communicate with us by allowing us over 2,000 years to read what they wrote. And next year is a very interesting anniversary, because next year, early next year, will be the 40th anniversary of the first serious search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It's a search that was launched by Frank Drake, who is a famous radio astronomer who knew Carl for many years. They were personally very close. Frank and Carl were at Cornell University together during similar periods of time. And Frank, in early 1960, when I was 7 years old, decided to use a radio telescope in West Virginia, in a radio quiet valley of West Virginia, to scan two stars in the sky, which are pronounced, I think, Tau Ceti and Epsilon Eridani. Any amateur astronomers can correct me. He listened to these stars for a brief period of time, hoping to detect any kind of intelligent radio signal coming from planets that might be orbiting those stars. And the search, as is well known now, of course, was unsuccessful. Nothing was heard. But that was sort of the founding event of SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And that search has since continued. It's had many political and economic and scientific ups and downs in the 4 decades since, but it continues to this day, funded totally or almost totally privately, involving groups such as the SETI Institute in Mountain View, California, and the Planetary Society, and so forth. And what is the bottom line so far after 40 years? Well, the bottom line is that the search so far has completely failed. It has completely failed. There has been no detection whatsoever of any intelligent radio signal from the sky, or at least what we can say is indubitably an intelligent radio signal from another civilization. And it is important to stress several things before I say what I'm about to say. First of all, I'm a very strong supporter of SETI, and I have been all of my life. And I think the search needs to continue, and I urge all of you out there who have a little extra cash to send your contributions to the SETI Institute or the Planetary Society. I have no connection with these organizations. I don't get a cent. However, I do think the SETI search is worthwhile, and it should continue, because whatever it finds over the next couple of decades or centuries or however long it lasts will be interesting, whether it's positive or negative. But so far, the search appears to be negative. After 4 decades, no signals. And I want to propose today, now that we're on the brink of this 40th anniversary, that it may not be too early for us to begin to try to draw some preliminary, and I underline the word preliminary, conclusions from this negative finding, this so far negative finding. A fascinating thing about SETI is that it poses the most fundamental questions you can imagine about everything under the sun. Questions that are not just scientific in nature, specifically astronomical and biological, but also sociological, economic, political, and so forth. Many of you are perhaps familiar with the so-called Drake equation, named after Frank Drake. The Drake equation, which was pioneered in the early 1960s at a scientific conference in West Virginia at the same radio telescope, a scientific conference where young Carl Sagan was present and was described by everyone present as a brash young man, the same term Bill used, and that's correct. Everybody uses that word, brash young man, which meant he was rude and he interrupted people and he told Nobel laureates they didn't know what they were talking about. That was Carl. That's how you become famous sometimes. Maybe that's how you do it in American science. But anyway, at that West Virginia conference, the Drake equation was unveiled. Frank Drake drew it on the blackboard, and it consisted of a number of variables that said, here's how you might be able to guesstimate the number of intelligent radio communicating civilizations in our galaxy, the Milky Way. The variables in it included things such as the number of stars in our galaxy, which is pretty well known, 300, 400 billion, the number of stars with planets, which was not at all well known then, and today is somewhat better known, although we still don't really know very clearly. We're still getting data back on the extrasolar planets. The number of advanced civilizations out there, of course, nobody has a clue. How frequently life is likely to emerge on other planets. All of these things, all of these variables go into the mix, and from this you calculate the number of likely intelligent civilizations out there in space that might be interested in communicating with us by radio. And the estimates that come out of it are very subjective. Some people who were present at this 1961 conference had very low estimates. They thought there are probably very, very few other intelligent civilizations in our galaxy. Carl was quite the optimist. Carl said, I think, that there are probably 1 million, give or take a few, intelligent civilizations out there that are advanced, perhaps more advanced than we are, and are capable of communicating with us. And so the Drake equation, its basic premise is that if you take all these variables, it can help you estimate the likelihood of intelligent life in the universe. And these variables thereby pose very fundamental questions. Questions such as, how does life emerge on a planet? For example, on the Earth, billions of years ago, how did the building blocks, the chemical building blocks of life first appear? How did those building blocks evolve into self-replicating, mutating, evolving microorganisms that then over time evolved into intelligent species, into us, in other words? How likely is intelligence to emerge on a planet? I mean, what is intelligence? These are things actually that are quite difficult to define when you try to define them. It's like artificial intelligence. When you try to define it, it turns out nobody really knows what it is, like art. What is it? It's a very subjective judgment. What were the processes that caused intelligent life on Earth to give rise to what we call high technology? And how likely is it that high technology would develop on other planets orbiting other stars in our galaxy? From what we know from anthropology, there's really no guarantee that a culture will develop in a technological direction. Many cultures, most cultures really, if you look at history, don't move in a high technological direction. Many of them perhaps are perfectly content to remain stable societies that have stable economic situations. They don't develop high technologies. They're perfectly happy to maintain a kind of technological and cultural stasis over thousands of years, and many people would argue they're a lot happier than we are. Maybe most planetary systems out there in our galaxy are exactly like that. They're not technological, they don't have radio, therefore we can't communicate with them, they can't communicate with us. So in other words, the bottom line is, the Drake equation raises incredibly fundamental questions about every subject you can think about in the university curriculum. And Carl Sagan's estimate was 1 million intelligent civilizations out there. It's an arm-waving estimate, but that's the one that Carl helped to make famous. And now after 40 years, the SETI searches that have been conducted have scanned millions and millions of stars out there, and so far, as I said, no indubitably intelligent signals have been picked up. There have been little beeps and bumps here and there, but they've either turned out not to be replicable, or they've turned out to have very mundane explanations, ranging from secret Air Force experiments to literally the firing of spark plugs in passing automobiles, which send out faint radio signals. And so we haven't heard a thing after 40 years of searching. And what I want to propose is that it may be time for scientists to start to harvest the scientific and the cultural meaning of this negative finding. Not that we should stop searching, we should keep searching, but what does it mean that we haven't detected those signals yet? Well, Carl Sagan was a big optimist on the idea that the building blocks of life are likely to emerge on the surface of a planet. He was an optimist about this because in the 1950s, he attended the University of Chicago. He was a young undergraduate and later graduate student there. And while he was there, he witnessed one of the great experiments in the history of biology, now known as the Miller-Urey experiment, after the scientists who did it. Stanley Miller, now at San Diego, and Harold Urey, who was then at Chicago, Nobel laureate, discovered deuterium, and later went to San Diego, is now dead. The Miller-Urey experiment, you can read about in every high school chemistry book. And some of you may remember actually how it is done. It just involves a flask. You put certain reducing chemicals in it. You add some water. You electrify it, electrical discharges. You leave it overnight, and it turns out that you rapidly develop large amounts of amino acids, which are the chemical building blocks of proteins, which are simple, essential building blocks of life as we know it. And Carl Sagan, when he was a young student there, went into the laboratory where Stanley Miller was doing this experiment, and he saw the flask with its sort of pinkish coating like Pepto-Bismol on the inside wall. Here it is, it's creating all these amino acids. It's demonstrating that under simple conditions, very much like the early atmosphere of Earth, with reducing gases, water, and electrical discharges, probably from lightning, you can get the building blocks of life. It appeared that the building blocks of life could be generated very easily in conditions that probably existed not just on the early Earth, but on planets all across the galaxy. Reducing gases, that is hydrogen-rich gases, hydrogen is the most common element in the universe. So this experiment transformed Carl Sagan's thinking about extraterrestrial life. When he was a young person, he had been excited about the possibility of extraterrestrial life because he read a lot of popular science, and he read a lot of science fiction, Edgar Rice Burroughs in particular. So he was emotionally ready to accept the idea of life on other worlds. He was also a big UFO buff, which also motivated him considerably. But what really got him thinking about extraterrestrial life scientifically was the Miller-Urey experiment. That's what really launched him. He was not directly connected with it, of course, but it launched him emotionally. And for the rest of his life, Carl, I think, continued to believe that the universe was and is, to use a Hollywood term, life-affirming. The universe likes to generate life. When you look out there at the night sky, what you're seeing in Carl's view are just jillions and jillions of Miller-Urey type experiments underway right now in the atmospheres of planets orbiting alien stars. Life is being constantly generated, or at least its building blocks are. And because Carl was a great optimist about these things, he also believed that once you created the building blocks of life, that was pretty much it. Everything else was simple. You would then just have a short step to the development of organisms and then eventually intelligence with which you could communicate. And I think after 40 years we can say that in that sense Carl was naive. And I think he began to realize late in his own life that he was naive. Evolution is in fact not that simple. It's difficult to generate the building blocks of life in real, believable planetary environments because the universe doesn't just create the building blocks of life, it also destroys them. In the late 50s, Carl was a graduate student, and he did part of his doctoral dissertation on the possibility that Miller-Urey type chemical processes had occurred in the atmosphere of the moon, which in the early solar system probably did have a very thin atmosphere, a reducing atmosphere. And Carl in his dissertation calculated that these organic molecules by Miller-Urey processes would just start piling up on the moon, you know, like Midas's gold, higher and higher, and that over millions of years these would form into through various random processes into replicating, mutating, living creatures. And that's why in the 1960s, he and Joshua Lederberg and a few other scientists warned that when the first astronauts went to the moon, they might encounter microbes and they might accidentally bring them back to Earth where they would wipe us all out. So we needed the lunar quarantine program. That's why they advocated the famous or infamous lunar quarantine. That was all a long-term spin-off of the Miller-Urey experiment. And so Carl was a big optimist about this. He thought the universe would just generate piles and piles of life. But what Carl forgot was that the universe also destroys life. And over the last 40 years, what's one of the things that we've learned about our universe from astronomy and from the geological and the biological sciences? What we've learned is that the universe isn't just life-affirming, it's also life-destroying. We've learned that the history of life on Earth is not just the traditional uniformitarian tale of life slowly evolving over millions of years, but it's also comets falling to Earth and wiping out an otherwise perfectly successful species, the dinosaurs. It's a matter of random processes in evolution that may never replicate themselves again. And so after 40 years, I think we're at a point where we can say that the stars are silent partly because the universe, contrary to what Carl thought, is actually pretty hostile to life. And that tells us something about our own future here on Earth. The more we learn about astronomy, the more we learn about ways in which we, as a species, may have a limited lifespan on this Earth. We may be destroyed by a falling comet. We might see an interstellar cloud pass through our solar system someday. I'm talking about thousands or millions of years, thereby dimming the sun, changing the climate, and freezing us all to death. Or the thing that Carl, late in life, as he got more sober and mature, really began to worry about, and that is the possibility that we may destroy ourselves. That's why in the 1980s, Carl became a very visible anti-nuclear activist. He became very active in trying to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons because he began to realize that the reason why the stars are silent, why we're not hearing greetings from the heavens, may be at least partly because the universe is full of destroyed civilizations. There may be millions of planets out there with civilizations on them, but they're the ruins of civilizations, and they're smoking and they're radioactive, and that may be our fate next. And that's why I think if Carl were here today, he would express, on the one hand, great relief that since the end of the Cold War, we've seen a substantial diminution in the size of the world's nuclear arsenals. But I think he would also express great concern about the fact that we haven't completely eliminated nuclear weapons, that the superpowers still have thousands of nuclear weapons in their arsenals, that recently we've seen Boris Yeltsin sort of rattling the nuclear sabers again for his own political agenda, that recently there's been talk about gutting the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and I think the thing that would sadden and anger Carl the most is the U.S. Senate's inexplicable decision not to accept the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So I think if Carl were here today, he would tell us, although he was an atheist, he might choose to use metaphorical words. He might say that God hasn't given up on us yet, but if you listen to the stars and you hear nothing, their silence may tell you that God doesn't have infinite patience with us as well, and soon we may also be wiped off the slate. I want to thank you very much.
Okay, we'll take your questions now for a few more minutes, and please repeat the question. So, do we have any? See, we have to. Where? We got one way over here, but we got the microphone way over there. Do we have any over here for right now? All right. Well, you want to just stand up and boom it out.
I'm wondering, given that you're immersed in Carl's life, I've talked to many people who know him. What do you think the fact that he wasn't elected to the National Academy was an unkind emotional response on the part of the current members who could have elected him, or was a valid intellectual evaluation of his scientific work?
Bill, do you want
Yeah,
to?
Bill, why don't you stand up right up to the microphone? And
The first thing I should probably say is that he actually was elected in the initial balloting, but the rules say that they then bring this to the floor in the meeting, and someone can challenge it. It's almost like the thing in a marriage ceremony where you say, you know, if anyone knows any reasons, speak up now or hold your peace. Well, it was during that people challenged him, and eventually in the new balloting they decided to keep him out. The people who were against him basically felt that he was a popularizer, not someone who actually did science. And that's what really counted against him. But of course, there's no strict rules regarding the Academy. I mean, people have been elected just because of their administrative work. And as Mr. Shermer certainly demonstrated, Carl's scientific career, if you go by the number of papers, was really quite impressive and up there with many people that we revere as great scientists. For my money, he should be in the Academy. Do you want to?
I agree, and I think Bill put it very well. I agree with what he said. I would like to add one thing. I think that it is complicated. The larger question really is how good a scientist was Carl Sagan, and there's really no simple answer. I think he was a very solid scientist. He knew a lot about many different sciences, some of them more deeply than others. He speculated, sometimes a little carelessly perhaps, but all in all, I think he should have been admitted, and I suspect that one factor in him being kept out, or two factors, is one, he could be abrasive sometimes, as Bill pointed out earlier, and I think he made enemies he shouldn't have made, and second, I think his anti-nuclear activities cost him a lot of support among some of the more conservative members of the Academy.
Yes, I'd agree with that as well.
I have a question. Do the mic. This is from Ann Dream.
Oh, yeah.
And her concern is that you both relied too heavily on Lester Grinspoon, who had a falling out with Carl, who has an agenda against Carl. And I'm wondering how you judged Grinspoon's commentary on Carl as a person in the context that maybe he was angry at him, or they had this falling out.
I didn't say he was angry at him. He said several times that he felt very honored to have known Carl as a person. It was a case, I mean, he was his best friend for really from the 1960s until the mid-1990s. You have to listen to everyone if you're trying to write a responsible biography and sort of weigh everything. Both of them were obviously extremely wonderful and helpful sources, and I just weigh everything together and try to write the best biography I can.
Okay, sure. And I concur. I mean, Annie Dreehan, by the way, is somebody I have enormous respect for. I think she had enormous impact on Carl, intellectually, emotionally, and politically. But I can only say that Lester expressed great affection for Carl's memory. So did Lester's son, David, who was very close to Carl when they were growing up. There were personal falling outs, but when you talk to these people, I mean, both of them urged me not to overstate their criticisms of Carl, because as David Grinspoon himself said, David's now a leading planetary scientist, he said that my father and I are very, very grateful to have had Carl Sagan in our lives. And I think that's one thing that struck me about in 2 years of research, I never found a single person, not one person, who knew Carl Sagan really well who just hated him. I mean, people had mixed feelings about him. Some people loved him and hated him. But, you know, he had so many wonderful qualities. I think it was very hard for someone for someone's views to be rejected on the grounds that they just hated him, because I didn't find anybody like that.
Except for Edward Teller, apparently.
Edward Teller, yes, but he had his own agenda.
Yeah.
Here's an idea. We've heard a lot about deathbed conversion, but in the end he was calling to God and praying and all those kind of things. Can you put those to rest?
It's just an urban legend.
Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the things Julian, certainly made sure that I was very clear on.
That's right. In fact, similar deathbed conversion stories are told of Charles Darwin and Bertrand Russell. One of the ways, one of the ways that the purveyors of superstition and flimflammery try to outlast history is by rewriting history. And Carl wanted it very clearly known. He remained an atheist to the end. He did not believe in an afterlife. Annie herself has very courageously maintained that point of view publicly, and I think it's a very courageous thing to do.
There's one up there. Take it down. Hang on one second. Okay.
I think you rightly pointed out that Carl Sagan will be best remembered for his popularizing of science. I was just wondering from each of you, what do you think his most important single scientific achievement or accomplishment was in his life, or his most important paper?
Something I've heard from a lot of people is his paper on the early faint sun paradox. Yes. This has to do with the fact that that our astronomers know that that the sun has over time been burning hotter and hotter. And if you try to project that back, you figure that there must have been a time when the oceans would have been frozen solid. But the fossil record is very clear that throughout at least the vast majority of Earth's history, there have been liquid oceans. You can see remains like of the ripples where waves came in and were fossilized. So somehow you have to explain that. Sagan did a paper back in, I'm not sure what year, 70s?
I think.
Yeah. When he was writing the Mr. X piece, actually. So maybe there's a connection there.
Pure coincidence.
But at any rate, it's been an extremely influential paper. He proposed one possible explanation for it that involved an evolving greenhouse effect, which changed just in sync to keep the Earth's temperature essentially the same. Now, many other explanations have been advanced since then, and no one is saying that Sagan's is going to be judged as the final one. But certainly it's had an incredible influence. If you look at the number of citations, this is certainly one of his most cited of all papers.
I agree. I think the faint early sun paradox paper is extraordinarily important. It's beginning to get new attention. James Casting, among others, has pointed it out as a prescient paper. Certainly, Carl is best known among scientists for his Venus greenhouse work, but it's likely other people would have wrapped that up sooner or later if Carl hadn't. In fact, it's certain they would have. I'd like to suggest that there's a lot of gold in Sagan's research. I point out in the preface to my book that there are a number of prophecies, if I may call it that before a group like this, prophecies that Carl made where he had scientific ideas, he and colleagues had scientific ideas that have turned out to be correct or may well turn out to be correct. What's funny is the reasoning process that went into them is often erroneous. Not always. Carl, for example, along with another scientist whose name I've forgotten, did some research back in the 1970s with computer modeling of the formation of planetary systems, which showed... Stephen Dole, yeah, okay. Yeah. And they showed that some planetary systems, extrasolar planetary systems, might have extraordinarily large gas giant planets right next to their suns. Well, now we're finding all these extrasolar planets, and this completely counterintuitive prediction is turning out to be true. Now, was the reasoning process right? Well, people will have to go back and look at it. But I think this is important for one very important reason. It suggests that often scientific advances may be made for the wrong reasons. In other words, by going down blind alleys, you can often get to the truth.
Take one more question right there.
I wanted to sort of explore the characterization of Carl Sagan as an atheist. I know in everything that I've read written by Carl Sagan himself, he sort of was a little more complex on the issue. He said it depended on what your definition of a God would be, and he had no problem adopting the God of Einstein or of Spinoza. And in one essay in 1977, he said that an atheist is someone that has conclusive proof that a God does not exist, and I don't have that proof, so I take the agnostic position. So I'm wondering how you sort of sort through that and decide based on everything in totality what his beliefs are or how they fit.
Well, he certainly wasn't lying when he said that if you want to be perfectly accurate, since he doesn't have proof that there's no God, he would be classified as an agnostic. But I think if you look at the totality of what he wrote, he's basically saying that he doesn't believe in the Judeo-Christian God any more than like the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus or other things that, strictly speaking, I mean, you can't prove they don't exist either. So I think it's almost in that category.